everyone, I'm Lucy Hockings in Qatar's capital Doha. It is day 46 of the conflict between the US, Israel and Iran, and over the next quarter of an hour or so we'll bring you up to date with all the latest developments and what they could mean for the conflict. Let's start with the main developments today. Talks between Israeli and Lebanese officials are taking place in Washington. It's the first time the two sides have sat down face to face in decades. President Trump says talks aimed at ending the war in Iran could resume in the next 2 days after they broke down at the weekend in Pakistan. Projections from the International Monetary Fund suggest the war in Iran may lead to a global recession, with estimates suggesting the UK could be the hardest hit of the world's major economies. But let's start with the historic meeting between diplomats from Israel and Lebanon taking place at the US State Department in Washington. The talks follow 6 weeks of Israeli bombardment in Lebanon that has left more than 2,000 people dead, with at least a quarter of them women, children and medical workers. Hezbollah, who have been firing rockets at Israel, described the talks as futile, saying the group will not surrender. Israel and Lebanon do not have diplomatic relations. This will be the first formal face-to-face meeting for both sides in decades. We have correspondents for you from across the region. At the US State Department in Washington is Neda Tawfiq. Joel Gunter is in Jerusalem for us, and Hugo Bachega is in Beirut. So let's take you straight to the US State Department in Washington and join Neda Tawfiq, who is there covering the talks. Has any progress been made, Neda?
Well, Lucy, these talks have been going on for more than 2 hours, and we understand they are going to be wrapping up. But look, I think from the outset, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, despite calling this a historic opportunity, really did kind of temper expectations, saying that the goal of this meeting was to lay out a framework for an eventual lasting peace deal that they hope to achieve. We were told that, this is, of course, at low level, ambassadors from Israel and Lebanon speaking, but that the fact that the U.S. Secretary of State is there shows that the U.S. takes this seriously, that they are going to have these working discussions to see if future talks can also be planned. But Lucy, I think there's also a real understanding, again, as the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio underscored, about the complexities here, the decades of history. And you really can't forget that Hezbollah is not a part of these talks and has rejected these talks. So while the U.S., Israel and Lebanon might be on the same page about having Hezbollah disarmed, they are already not on the same page there, and that is no easy task. Israel, of course, has been trying to do that. The Lebanese government doing that, of course, evokes for many people memories of the bloody civil war that the country endured, and no one wants to go back to that. And so for the Lebanese government, they are coming into these talks saying very clearly that for them, this is about their sovereignty. There are real fears about Israel continuing to occupy the south of Lebanon. They want that to come to an end. For Israel, the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is saying that he will continue Israel's military campaign against Hezbollah, that these talks are more about establishing a peace deal in the future with Lebanon. And it's interesting, we did have a State Department official share, Lucy, that they want to make it clear that the U.S. does not see this as part of the talks with Iran, that for them this is about divorcing Lebanon from Iran's influence. But experts I've been speaking to, everyone clearly state that you really can't divorce these two issues, that unless there is an agreement between the U.S. and Iran, it's hard to see movement when it comes to Lebanon and Israel being forced at the table to kind of have a ceasefire, for Israel to have a ceasefire and for a deal in the future. And certainly for Iran, they have always believed that a ceasefire with the U.S. included Lebanon. And for them, strategically, for their credibility, they would need Hezbollah to be part of that ceasefire and ultimate agreement.
Neda, thank you so much. To Joel Gunter now, who is in Jerusalem for us. As Neda was saying, calls from Lebanon for a ceasefire, Joel, that has been rejected by the Israelis. So what has Israel brought to the table today in Washington?
We're waiting now any minute for the Israeli ambassador Yechiel Leiter to come out of this initial round of talks today to speak to the press. But Leiter, among other Israeli officials, has been very, very clear in recent days, as you said, that Israel is not prepared to commit to, even to discuss a ceasefire with Hezbollah, let alone remove the many Israeli troops who are involved in ground operations in the south of Lebanon. As you've been hearing, that was made very clear that that was a precondition for Hezbollah, and Lebanese officials saying the same thing, that before there was any real peace and normalization process, that there would have to be a ceasefire with Israel. So the two sides seem to still be apart on that fundamental issue. The Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has backed this process, but it is hard to see. He's backed it somewhat under pressure from the US, but it is hard to see a clear way forward for Israel without that commitment to a ceasefire with Hezbollah.
Also standing by is Hugo Bachega, who is in Beirut. Hugo, it has been made very clear by the Israelis that Hezbollah needs to disarm. That is something that the Lebanese government hasn't been able to do. How have Lebanese officials and the Lebanese ambassador approached these talks in Washington?
Yeah, Lucy, so everybody here in Lebanon has been, waiting to see what is going to emerge from these talks today. I think the Lebanese authorities, the priority for them is a ceasefire. This war has been devastating for this country. You mentioned the humanitarian crisis with more than 1 million people displaced. You mentioned that more than 2,000 people have been killed since the beginning of the conflict. We've seen large parts of the country completely destroyed. But the Lebanese have very little to offer, as Nada was saying, that they cannot deliver Hezbollah's disarmament. And this is one of the key roots of this problem, Hezbollah's weapons. So here in Lebanon, this is a country divided. Opponents of Hezbollah have been accusing the group of defending the interests of Iran, which is Hezbollah's main supporter, of dragging Lebanon into these wars with Israel, and they want Hezbollah to be disarmed. And this has been a key demand, not only of many Lebanese, but also the US and Israel. On the other hand, you have supporters of Hezbollah saying that, look, this is the only force we have to protect our land, particularly in the south of the country. They see Israel as the enemy, in their words, intent in seizing Lebanese territory. So they say they need the weapons. They say, look, the country is being invaded. The state is unable to protect us, and we need our weapons to protect our territory and to protect our community. So it is a very difficult situation for the Lebanese authorities. And the president has been clear for a very long time that disarmament is not going to happen by force and that a deal is needed with Hezbollah.
Hugo, thank you. Here are some of the other top lines from today. The United States has insisted no ships pass through its blockade of Iranian ports during the measure's first 24 hours. The BBC had earlier analysed data suggesting at least 4 Iran-linked ships passed through the Strait of Hormuz since the blockade was imposed. China's foreign ministry has condemned the blockade as dangerous and irresponsible. The BBC also understands that Chinese officials have held talks behind the scenes to try and help nudge Tehran back towards the negotiating table. China, to remind you, is Tehran's biggest trading partner and buys around 80% of Iran's oil. Italy's government has announced it would be suspending its long-standing defence agreement with Israel. The Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, said the decision was made in light of the current situation and didn't give any further details. Well, let's focus a bit more now on the global economy, the world's finances. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, today issued a number of warnings about the global economy. Speaking at the start of their spring conference, the boss of the organisation said any continuation of the conflict in Iran could put the global economy at risk of recession. It's particularly bad news for the UK, which the IMF singled out as the one that could be hardest hit of the world's major economies. Straight to Washington, that's where the IMF is based. We can speak to our business correspondent, Michelle Fleury, and it's Michelle who has been speaking to the head of the IMF. He was pretty gloomy, Michelle.
Yeah, I mean, he said that this was certainly worse than the oil shock of the 1970s. I mean, we knew it was going to be bad, but they have revised down their growth forecast. Now, this is a sharp contrast, Lucy, to where we were at the start of this year when they were talking about the resilience of the global economy. Instead, they're painting a pretty dire picture here, but because the situation is so fluid, they've done something they haven't done before, and that is that they've come up with 3 forecasts. So what they're saying is a kind of referral forecast where growth would be trimmed slightly, but 2 others which are much more severe. The worst one being projecting essentially a global recession if this conflict continues for a long time. What's interesting is that I'm hearing from people here that even that worst case scenario may be too optimistic, that they say that is the baseline that we should be thinking about. Certainly for countries, obviously you mentioned the UK, which of the rich countries is one of the kind of hardest hit initially, but amongst other net oil importers, the damage is going to be pretty stark. Countries like Pakistan, other countries where you're talking about not just job losses, but potentially also hunger and sort of poverty there caused by this crisis.
Michelle, thank you. The fallout from the conflict in the Middle East is throwing a number of issues into the spotlight for Western nations. In the UK, the former head of NATO has accused the country of complacency in defence, saying Britain's security defences were in peril. The amount that NATO countries spends on defence has long irked President Trump, but this criticism is coming from someone who was a former Labour politician. Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale has been looking at where the UK comes among other nations in terms of what it spends on defence.
The government says defence spending is rising and will reach £65 billion next year. That's 2.5% of national income or GDP. Longer term, it said it will meet a new NATO target of spending 3.5% of GDP on defence, but that's by 2035, still a long way off. The reality is the UK is already falling behind other NATO allies. Look at this chart. In 2020, the UK was the 4th largest spender in the alliance in terms of GDP on defence. But this latest NATO chart, 2025, shows it's dropped to 14th place, behind many other nations which are living closer to Russia and are ramping up their defence spending much faster.
Let's cross to Westminster and speak to our political correspondent Ian Watson. So this report from Lord Robertson, Ian, presents yet another headache for Keir Starmer.
Yes, it does. I think Keir Starmer, the victim of friendly fire, if you like, from George Robertson, because, as you say, he is not somebody who would naturally attack the government. He's a former Labour Defence Secretary, a former Secretary-General of NATO, but also the person chosen by Keir Starmer to lead the Strategic Defence Review during this government's time in office as well. And the criticisms from Lord Robertson are quite simply that the means to put his recommendations in that review into force are simply not being delivered or delivered quickly enough. He says, not mincing his words, that we are underprepared, underinsured and under attack. We are not safe. Britain's national security and safety is in peril. So he doesn't mince his words, but politically the difficulty for Keir Starmer too is that what Lord Robertson is saying is that, look, we're spending too much on welfare and not enough on defence, and that's given opposition parties an opportunity to kick the Prime Minister as well. Reform UK saying they agree with Lord Robertson. Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, similarly saying that less should be spent on welfare, but also she said that she'd divert money from net zero projects into defence as well. So this has given Keir Starmer a big political challenge. What the government says is they're spending more on defence than at any time since the Cold War. They'll continue to increase defending year after year. And in addition to that, they say they reject the accusation that Britain's currently not safe.
Ian, thank you so much. Well, that's it from me here in Doha. As I prepare to head home, I leave a watchful region. It is full of hope here that the current ceasefire between the US and Iran will hold, that there will be these talks that could take place in Pakistan to find some sort of common ground, and that they will continue over the next few days. People here want a return to predictability. They want a return to stability. And for the Gulf nations and the global economy as a whole, the stakes couldn't be higher. They're also so high, as we've been hearing too, for Lebanon, facing a humanitarian crisis after Israeli strikes and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people from the south. Without a lasting ceasefire between the Israel-US alliance and Iran, there's no hope for a ceasefire there either. But tonight, here in Qatar, I've just been for a walk. Daily life is returning to normal. The skies are quiet, but in the Strait of Hormuz, it's about 300 miles behind me. The chance of it escalating into a military conflict is very high, and the shattering of this calm is ever present. Whether you have joined us on YouTube, TikTok, Sounds, radio or TV, thanks for your time. I won't be back with you, but one of my colleagues will be tomorrow with the Iran War Today.